I mean, the choice is nuclear war. The choice is seeing our children die quickly in a nuclear war or slowly.
On missiles are in our country, we're asking for a hearing in your courts. It's not much to ask.
Stand up, fight for your rights, defend yourself against nuclear death.
This program is about the women of Greenham Common and their lawsuit against the United States government demanding a stop to the deployment of American nuclear missiles in Great Britain. In this unusual suit, 13 British women and their 17 minor children were joined by 2 U.S. congressmen in a legal battle against cruise and Pershing missiles. The plaintiffs maintain that these nuclear weapons are illegal under constitutional and international law. In their view, President Reagan and his government should be held accountable for their illegal deployment. This lawsuit by the Greenham women came after extensive protests throughout Great Britain in which women were arrested, tried, and jailed. Still, the Greenham women felt like plaintiffs, not defendants. They amassed evidence in order to put cruise missiles on trial in an American court of law. They collected testimonies from 30 experts, hundreds of written statements from national and international organizations. But the judges ruled that the volumes of legal evidence and argument were inadmissible, and the case against cruise missiles was thrown out of court. The purpose of this documentary is to admit this evidence to the court of public opinion. We begin this story of the Greenham legal action by remembering how the nuclear arms race began, with the dropping of atomic bombs on Japan.
At 08:15 on August 6, over military target Hiroshima, Bombardier Major Farabee took over. He was about to drop the atom bomb.
Atomic bombs annihilated more than 71,000 people in Hiroshima and nearly 74,000 in Nagasaki. So America became the first superpower willing to use nuclear weapons against civilians. Then the Soviet Union joined the United States in the race for military superiority. Billions were spent on developing and testing nuclear weapons. Atomic bomb tests spewed radioactive pollution into the atmosphere and soil. And as politicians and military leaders pressed for increasingly deadlier weapons in the 1950s, peace movements in both the United States and Europe rose up in protest. In the United States, women came together in organizations such as Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and Women's Strike for Peace. They organized protests against the nuclear arms race and a campaign to end nuclear testing. There were also individual acts of conscience.
Dorothy Day used to stand alone by herself out there, in City Hall Park and be arrested, when they did the air raid drills. And then one year, 15 people stayed with her, and the next year, 3,000. So then, and we ended air raid drills. That ended the whole thing. Everybody stood there laughing and laughing and laughing.
Women led peace marches, handed out leaflets, contacted government officials. They collected thousands of signatures and petitioned President Kennedy to sign a treaty with the Soviet Union to stop nuclear testing in the atmosphere.
There was one demonstration I remember when they brought a huge, about block-long dish towel and hung it up in front of the White House, spread it out on the fence. It was signed by thousands of women. It was an anti-nuclear petition. But there was a kind of feeling that we're housewives and we're proud of it, and it's time for housewives to be heard. There was no shame about it. In fact, there was a little extra pride about it, and using it. Because there was a feeling that you, society, you guys in the White House and in the Kremlin and all over the world said that we should raise the children. Now you don't even let us do it.
And there was a talk of arms control and arms reduction, but only talk. The arms race continued anyway. The United States wanted nuclear missiles to deter Soviet armies from overrunning Europe. The Soviets felt threatened by the U.S. military bases that encircled them and their allies. Yet during the period of détente, there was hope that talk would lead to a safer world. The Strategic Arms Limitation Treaties, SALT I in 1972 and SALT II in 1979, attempted to maintain a balance of terror between Soviet and American weapons. In the United States, opponents of SALT II charged that this treaty left open a window of vulnerability and worked against its ratification by Congress. This spelled the end of détente. The United States and Soviet Union raced to build up their arsenals with advanced weaponry, including new intermediate-range missiles destined for Europe. In 1978, there was a dual-track decision by NATO to deploy cruise and Pershing II missiles in Europe, while at the same time NATO was to find ways to limit, reduce, or even eliminate these weapons. At that time, the United States enunciated its policy of flexible response. The United States would consider the first use of nuclear weapons even in a conventional war.
The concept behind the deployment of Pershing and Glickham was to ensure that the defense of Europe and the defense of the United States are one and the same. By being able to strike targets in the Soviet Union from European territory, this linkage is ensured. And by ensuring that linkage, we enhance deterrence and the prevention of war.
In 1982, the United States and the Soviet Union began the Strategic Arms Reduction Talks, or START as it was called, which ended without agreement at the end of 1983. With the end of détente and resurgence of Cold War, Europeans feared they had the most to lose. There were protests against deploying Pershing and cruise missiles throughout Europe. In August 1981, a group of 40 women, children, and a few men marched 120 miles from Cardiff, Wales, to an American air base near London, which was to be armed with cruise missiles.
Very few people in the country knew anything about cruise missiles at that time. And they decided that they would stay outside this US Air Force base at Greenham Common to carry on this protest and to attract publicity, to open up the whole question, to a public debate. There'd been no parliamentary discussion, really no discussion in the newspapers about this proposal. It was just presented to British people as modernization. NATO was modernizing its weapons.
There were also protests in the United States, where the National Freeze Campaign sought to limit the development, testing, and deployment of new nuclear weapons, particularly the cruise and Pershing missiles in Europe. But despite overwhelming public support, the nuclear freeze movement did not influence government arms policies.
So there's this structural problem that the advisors told the politicians, they told Hart and Mondale, that they couldn't have a freeze, that a freeze wasn't wise, it wasn't a good idea, and they believed them, and it wasn't just Hart and Mondale, but the majority of the Democrats in the House of Representatives, including, liberal arms control proponents.
And Republicans attacked the freeze movement.
Simple-minded appeasement or wishful thinking about our adversaries is folly. It means the betrayal of our past, the squandering of our freedom. So I urge you to speak out against those who would place the United States in a position of military and moral inferiority.
So despite popular support for the freeze, the Reagan administration pressed on with nuclear weapons. And with the failure of the arms control talks in Geneva, new American missiles, the Cruise and Pershing II, were headed for Europe. These were tactical weapons designed for use in limited nuclear war.
In reality, the published accuracy of the cruise missile is about 100 to 300 feet. That means, fired from Greenham Common in England, you could strike 1,500 miles from that into the Soviet Union and place a warhead within a football field. Now, the difference between this revolutionary weapon and the old V-1 buzz bomb is the Turcom computer mapping system. It has a computer-guided system about the size of a small TV set, which allows it to have tremendous accuracy. The TV set is basically a radar scanning system, which scans the various areas that it's traveling under. It locks onto trees, locks onto mountaintops, valleys, and compares it with the radar mosaic that's inside the memory. By comparing and contrasting the image that it sees with the image in its memory, it locks onto these two images and then adjusts its fins to compensate for any deviation between what it sees and what it has in its memories, and as a consequence can fly virtually 20, 30 meters right above treetops and place a hydrogen bomb right in the courtyard of the Kremlin. This is a weapon system that we have never seen in warfare before.
In the case of the cruise missile, it will be almost impossible to determine whether or not they have a nuclear warhead or a conventional warhead. So that means, as far as arms control is concerned, it makes a complete shambles out of the arms control process. Now, if you marry up the Pershing II missile, the Trident II missile, the MX missile, and the cruise missiles all together, you have built a first strike capability. Not only a first use capability, but first strike. That is, a capability which can knock out a large proportion of the Soviets' retaliatory capability. That means the Soviets will be very nervous. That means the Soviets will be building the same capability against the U.S. And what have we achieved? We have achieved, in a period of a crisis, a very critical situation, because we will have put a hair trigger on the first use, first strike capability of both the United States and the Soviet Union.
In mid-November, the first shipment of cruise missiles arrived at Greenham Common, one of many air bases in Great Britain.
There will only be a few cruise missiles here by the end of this year. The rest will come in slowly over 5 years. They are easily transportable and could be returned to the United States as soon as a satisfactory agreement were reached with the Soviet Union.
There were protests at Greenham and elsewhere by people who feared that their country could become another Hiroshima. Helen John was one of several women who came from Great Britain to talk about Greenham Common to the American people.
Now, in a country that I live in, which is literally the size of a peanut compared to yours, we have 102 bases, NATO bases. In my country, we've had 16 cruise missiles stationed at a very tiny part of the countryside called Berkshire, which is in the south part of the country. It's about 60 miles from London. There are going to be 80 more weapons stationed there if this lunacy doesn't stop. Farther north, they're going to put 85 more at a base called Molesworth. If and when the world tension becomes too much for this brave force, they're going to take their weapons out and hide them over an area that will take the weapons and spread them over the countryside, so that instead of having 2 points that the enemy have to worry about, they focus on the whole country practically, and they will be focusing where 67% of the people live. And we're told this is to defend us, and we don't believe it. We have never felt so undefended in our lives.
We don't want this done in our name, either by the British government or by the United States government. We don't feel these missiles give us any protection. We don't want to see American taxpayers' money being spent on horrendously dangerous weapons systems which we think threaten us.
As the debate gathered, so more and more people began to be aware of the nuclear threat. And I think for a lot of women, the idea that nuclear weapons were going to actually be visible in a place in their country was a terrifying concept.
And the women's actions focused on the Greenham Common Air Base, where the first cruise missiles would be deployed.
The base at Greenham has a 9-mile perimeter with a big fence going all the way around it. And there are 8 gates. After the camp had been there for about 6 months, women decided that they wanted to blockade all those gates on a working day. And so they chose